Good evening, welcome. I'm Jared Leese. I'm the chairperson of the Bloomington Human Rights Commission. Thank you so much. We're very pleased that you've decided to join us tonight to hear the courageous and continuing story of Holocaust survivor Judy Meisel. The City of Bloomington has an active 9-person commission which advises the City Council to ensure all citizens have equal access to opportunities in areas identified by the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Providing educational opportunities such as tonight's program are a significant part of the Commission's work plan annually. The Human Rights Commission is pleased to partner with the Minnesota chapter of the Federal Bar Association and the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas to bring you this program. We'd also like to thank Gray Plant Moody for hosting tonight's reception. At this point, I would like to ask representatives from the Human Rights Commission, as well as the other organizations I mentioned, to stand for just a moment or wave so we can recognize you tonight. Thank you. Tonight's program is going to include a screening of the film Talk for Alt, the Judy Meisel story. Note cards and pens were provided to you as you entered the theater this evening to write questions during the film and during the program. Following the program tonight, volunteers will be in the aisles to collect those cards so we can cover some of those questions. Following the film, Judy and her son Michael will be here to answer your questions, moderated by Steve Hunnigs of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Finally, an esteemed panel tonight, including Professor Cornelius Nestler, Jeffrey Van Nest, and Dr. Ellen Kennedy will be here. That panel is going to be moderated by Adam Hansen from the Minnesota chapter of the Federal Bar Association. So at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce Bloomington Mayor Gene Winstead to the podium.
Well, good evening and welcome. And it is, on behalf of the Bloomington City Council, it is just truly an honor to have a full house this evening for this event and this program. Our Human Rights Commission was established 50 years ago this year. And over that 50 years, it has countless commissioners, partners, and community volunteers has put on programs like this. And they've been just tremendous for awareness and just to continue the human rights activities in the city of Bloomington. Tonight we welcome back Judy. She's here again with her son Michael Cohen, who were part of our Human Rights Commission's programs in both 2011 and 2012. And in 2012, during her visit, she spoke with high school students throughout the city. And she put on 4 presentations, and it was very impactful, and it was all part of our Diversity Day programs here in the city of Bloomington. We are pleased to have them both back to bring Judy's story alive again and to be joined by our esteemed panel to share the latest developments in Germany regarding the Nazi prison guards trials. As a reminder, following the film, there will be the opportunity to answer questions, so make sure you write down your questions and we can pass them to the aisle to make sure that as much information and there's the questions can be answered appropriately, so make sure you do that. In her film, Judy returns to Denmark, where she visits the grave of Paula Jensen, the woman who was a foster mother to Judy and her sister after they escaped to Denmark from the Nazi-occupied Poland. On her gravestone are the words, "Talk for Alt." Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's film, Talk for Alt, Survival of the Human Spirit. So if we could proceed. Thank you.
There is no one person better than another.
75 years after the Holocaust, survivor Judith Meisel has kept a promise she made to herself, to share her story.
We should know that this never should happen again.
That's why Judith stands to relive her harrowing experience.
I was born in Lithuania, and my father passed away a couple of weeks before the Russians came in. The following year, they came in and they immediately took everything away from us. We were taken out of our house and created a ghetto. And I kept asking my mother, what's happening? And she said, stop asking me because I don't know either. After the ghetto, they took us to the concentration camp. And I ended up in Stutthof.
There, Judith and her sister lost their mother.
My mother was taken into the gas chamber and she was killed there. I was already with 1 foot inside.
And she still remembers what one Nazi woman said.
She went around and she was saying, no one comes out alive from here. You're all gonna be killed by tomorrow, all of you.
Threats that kept on coming.
They told us that tomorrow we are going to be going for a long walk and you'll like it, they would say, and they would laugh.
But that death march led to Judith and her sister's freedom.
All of a sudden, as we walked far, I had no idea who they were or what was started bombing us. And the bombs were falling all over.
In the chaos, the two sisters got away, and after finding refuge in different places, they were liberated in Denmark.
And when I came to Denmark, I was free.
Since then, Judith married and had a family of her own, migrating to Canada and eventually the United States.
And I have 3 wonderful children. I got 5 great-grandchildren. That is so wonderful.
And while this 89-year-old's experience is remarkable, another twist came just last year.
We were contacted last year by the local FBI that the German authorities were interested in interviewing her because they were conducting an investigation on 2 Nazi guards who were at Stutthof the same time that she was there. There were very few survivors left from Stutthof.
And during a 4-hour visit at her Minnesota home,
they held up photographs of the 2 guards, and my mother had a very visceral reaction to the one photograph and said, that's Mädela. That's what my mother used to call him because he had long brown hair. Mädela means young girl in Yiddish. So there seemed to be a very strong connection and identification of this individual.
Since that identification, a 60-page indictment was released, and a trial is being considered.
For me, it's the lessons that she brings about combating racism and intolerance are probably the most important. Any opportunity that we have to tell her story for the important lessons that it imparts is a gift that we cannot take for granted.
Because that's why Judith lives, to share her story of survival.
We should see that this doesn't happen again, here or any other place, that we're all human beings.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Steve Hunnigs. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and let's have just a long round of applause for Judith and her family and her history. And thank you to the Bloomington Center for the Arts, Mayor Winstead, Bloomington Human Rights Commission, and all the people in Bloomington who have made it possible for us to be here tonight, and our special guest from Germany, Professor Nestler. Thank you for being here tonight. To my colleagues, Karen Schamer and Adam Hansen, who have worked so hard to put this program together. It's not the first time that the JCRC has had the pleasure of working with the Federal Bar Association on issues related to the Holocaust. 4 years ago, Lawyers Without Rights was a program, an exhibit brought here by then Chief Judge of the Federal District of Minnesota, Judge Michael Davis, Judge Susan Richard Nelson. That was about the fate of German Jewish lawyers and judges after Hitler came to power But moreover, it was about the fate of what happens when the rule of law collapses. What is it when society disintegrates? And we saw that happened in the Holocaust. The Bloomington Center for the Arts were also grateful because they hosted our JCRC Transfer of Memory exhibit, which is the color photographic portraits of survivors of the Holocaust who came to Minnesota, of which Judy is one, and we also have David Amram, who's also here today, both who are pictured in the exhibit. And so it's been a great delight for us to be able to organize this exhibit with photographer David Sherman and the writer Lily Chester, and perhaps sometime we'll get a chance to see it just at the airport, just at the Basilica of St. Mary's, now at the Minnesota National Guard in Duluth and Arden Hills in Rochester, all sorts of important places where it goes. But we're here tonight because we're going to hear from Judy. We're going to hear from her son, Michael Cohen, and you've seen this wonderful documentary about Judy's life. Mom, wife, teacher, civil rights advocate, survivor from Lithuania, a remarkable, remarkable person who's come here from Minneapolis via Philadelphia. Judy, it's been a wonderful opportunity to get to know you over the years, and my dear friend Michael Cohen, the son, who's a wonderful publicist for his mom. He does a great job. Michael does, as does the grandson and the website and the like, and Sonny Cohen, who are neighbors and friends, and Michael's also a JCRC board member, so good for you, Michael, for that. And a distinguished lawyer in intellectual property, 30 years of practice with the Great Plant Law Firm, and he has a pretty good jump shot as a basketball player on top of all that. So now we are going to move on to the question and answer portion of the evening. Michael's going to bring Judith up here. Later we're going to have our distinguished panel talking about legal issues after Professor Nestler has a chance to speak to us and tell us about the role that he plays in the prosecutions of Nazi war criminals. And finally, Judith has one more role in life, and that is witness, because she is a witness to, as you'll hear, to one last defendant at the Stutthof camp who is being pursued for the crimes that he committed at that time. And she is witness, and you'll hear more about it in a few minutes. So we now have Michael, we now have Judith, and we'll allow them to mic up here for a bit, and then I'll ask the first question. Meanwhile, as I understand it, people can write out their questions and bring them up, or they'll circulate up here, and I'll have a chance to ask your questions to Judith. Judith, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Michael, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, can you hear me
good.
okay?
My
Very good.
problem is,
So I'm going to ask the first question, and it's this, Judith.
my problem is that I can hear, but I can't make out the words.
Okay.
I'll repeat the question.
you have
to-
I'll repeat the question.
Michael,
Yeah.
ask your mom what it was like to meet Martin Luther King.
Mom, here, look.
Okay.
So Steve wants to know, in the film you mentioned that you met Martin Luther King. Can you share with us some of your
What
Martin Luther King, an experience meeting with Dr. Martin Luther King?
Okay. I can stand up better.
You can stand up.
I get tired a little bit of sitting. It is so wonderful to see here, to see all of them. I want to thank them very much, really, because it's incredible that you realize that you are alive, because we promised ourselves to the best that we can, whoever survives, that we will tell our story, and this is what is happening. So I met Martin Luther King. I was walking my dog, I was in Philadelphia, and I was walking them, the dog, and then there was a judge, forgot already his name. He was walking his dog, and it was snowing, and and he said, "Why don't you come and have something to eat with us?" And then I went there to eat, but I keep the Jewish dietary laws, so I didn't have that much with food. but I always took like a salad or something. And Martin Luther King was there and he introduced him, I can't remember, Alexander. He was the
He was a
judge
judge
there.
in Philadelphia.
And he said to him, why did you come here to not going to Israel? And I said, no, I couldn't go there because my brother couldn't go there because the British wouldn't allow the Jews to come. So I went into a whole thing. And then she brought out a nice, Sadie was her name. She brought out a big thing with things. She said, this is chitlings. Judy, you can't eat that. But in the corner, you have vegetables. And I'll never forget that he stand up, Martin Luther King, and he explained the Jewish dietary laws. He was very interested in other groups of other people. He wasn't Jewish. To me, he did more for the white people and African American, because what he did, he took the things that was so hatred, full of hatred, he wouldn't allow it. He didn't want it to hold on to it and to have it strong. And this was something. And I would come home and I would tell my kids, I would tell about him. I said, this is what I want you to grow up like. And we went a couple of times, I met him. And this last year, I had his daughter came to visit us. I've never met her, but she wanted to meet me. So that was a little time to have together. And she wanted to know about her father. Her father was incredible. And so that's it. I would like, yeah.
So, as my mother mentioned, Dr. King's youngest daughter was here visiting, and she had seen the article about my mother and was very much interested in meeting with people that had personal stories to share about her father. So she came over. Of course, my mother gave her something to eat, and she was very excited about that. But what was very interesting was my mother shared a story with her about my mother was at Princeton, and Martin Luther King was there meeting with some young black activists, and one of them walked up to Dr. King and said, Dr. King, please, I would really like some advice as to how I can, be as accomplished as you are. And he looked at the young man and he said, the first thing you need to do is go out and get a nice suit and dress better than you are. And what was remarkable about that, as my mother shared it with Dr. Martin Luther King's daughter, is here she's sitting on her sofa with torn jeans, which I'm sure they were $800 a pair, but she started laughing. It was a very, very, very funny story that she shared with her.
Judith, the documentary begins with you bringing cookies over to the
You can sit here.
African-American family that was the subject of the riots and mob. And I'll just say as a note here that the same thing happened in Minneapolis. There was an exhibit not long ago over at the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota about a very similar incident in the 1930s when a black family moved into a white neighborhood in Minneapolis and the chaos that ensued as they tried to intimidate the family to leave. But the question, Judith, is what motivated you to help this family, this African-American family?
What made you feel you had to go help the Baker family that night? What prompted you to do that?
I got it when I came to Philadelphia, and Folkoff, I never was in Folkoff before, but I heard about it on the newspaper, what was going on. To me, when I heard what was happened for the African American in Philadelphia, I felt that if they are being tortured and what was happening there and everything else, that if they don't have allowed to do the things they want to do and jobs and everything else, I felt that my home is not going to be very good either, if their homes are not very good either. And I became very, very involved. There are two wonderful, wonderful women sitting here who know me from the very beginning. And I want to tell you, that went out to say all over the world, right? Everywhere, speaking. And you would arrange it, everyone. I would like to stand up a minute and just, they came in today from, where did you come in from?
From Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, yeah. So they know all the things what was going on in Philadelphia. Stand up just for a minute, for just a minute. Now, Beverly, you too, come on. And we were going from place to place to speak. And to me, this was I tell you, the people that call me from all over are all people that I have used. I know them for maybe 50 years, and they were principals and that. There are here some people who came today and they remembered me because there were 2 high schools here that I came in to speak. Mm-hmm. And that was my joy, that I can go and tell them what had happened. And that this is an incredible, incredible place that we have here in this country.
If I can add just the reason that Martin Luther King was in Philadelphia that time when he had dinner with my mother was because there was a real issue with the unions in Philadelphia not allowing any blacks to join. And that was the primary reason that he was actually in meeting with that judge, Raymond Pace Alexander, at the time. So.
Michael, a question for you.
Okay.
It says, great question. How do you believe your childhood differed from other children because of your mother's experiences? Was she more protective?
Well, I'd say that's why I developed a great jump shot, but that's totally not related to that. No, I feel very fortunate that my mother shared her story with me, and I know other survivors have not been as able to share the story with their children, and I certainly can understand why that's the case. My cousins, for example, did not get that same opportunity from their parents, from her sister and her brother that I did, and I think that it's made a real difference in the values that I have because of what she was able to do and what she continues to do.
Judith, why from, I'll say, probably a relatively young age, did you want to share your story of survival with your children?
Why did you feel that it was so important for you to share your story with your children?
With my children?
Yes.
Oh, I did not want them to make them feel very, very suffering what happened to me. But until they were not into about 15, 16 years, I could sit down and talk to them. Actually, or maybe a little bit earlier. But I never really go and created pain for them. I wanted them to be normal. They were born here in the United States, and my oldest daughter was born in Canada, and to me this was very important. But I have to tell you, JCRC is such a wonderful, wonderful place that you have here. I was very involved in ADL for many, many years. But when I came here, I said, is there an ADL? And they said, no, you don't need it. You have a JCRC. And you've done greatness to hear that you can bring so many people together.
I didn't pay her
That
to
is
say
so
that.
important. And also the people that organized it, I want to thank them very much to bring them together.
Michael, you're excused from the next board meeting for that.
And the question about the importance of passing this story on, for me, and this, I'm not trying to plug the JCRC one more time, but the exhibit transfer of memory that Steve had mentioned, the whole reason for the title, Transfer of Memory, is survivors are not going to be around, forever. And these stories and the film that you saw, those memories and those stories have to continue on to be told, obviously, by the second generation. But it's each and every one of you's responsibility and obligation now, too. You've seen the story. You can see that this really did happen. And there are people out there that deny the Holocaust, that deny that this really occurred. If you are in the lobby, you can see there's actually a page of the logbook from Stutthof concentration camp that has my grandmother's name, the date that she was murdered there, November 21st, 1944, and other information. So they did not want to hide this. It really did happen. And so, again, this transfer of memory is very important, and that's why I think these stories are important for her to tell me, but more importantly for each and every one of you, that you know that this really did happen.
The eminent historian of the Holocaust, Deborah Lipstadt, has said that, unfortunately, since the end of World War II, since the end of the Shoah, the Hebrew word for Holocaust, the expression never again, unfortunately, has meant again and again and again throughout the world. And here's a question along those lines. What can we do to ensure that the Holocaust never occurs again?
What can we do to make sure that this does not happen again?
Oh, with you thinking and with the above to them, I think that we can make it. We can make it from the time they start, from birth on. When you sit down with them at the table and eat, I'm convinced that all the hatred, anti-Semitism, and all the isms, and to speak against other people and so forth, that's something that should not happen at the dinner table where children would learn about. Because this is something that we should be for one another. There is not a single person that is better than another human being. We're all together. And we all have one God. And nobody is better than the other one. And this is something that we have to live about that. And the most important thing is to respect each other's, who we are. And that's the most important thing, especially now. This is the most important thing. To me, there is no one that is so outstanding that you can't talk to. Yes, you can. One person can do a lot. But thank God that Hitler, with 1,000 Reich, he wanted to create, to do away with all the Jews and all that. He killed 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children, Jewish children, and 5 million Christians who risked their lives to help. That there is today several people who went through the Holocaust because they risked their lives to do that. And this is what we have to do. We have to care for one another.
Or as you've often said, Judith, bear witness for those who perished and bear witness for those who suffer persecution to this day. Here's a question, and maybe this will presage Professor Nestler a bit. But Judith, you had this remarkable experience where members of the German equivalent of the FBI, accompanied by FBI agents, we have Jeff Van Nest here of the Minneapolis office of the FBI, came to talk to you about your experiences at Stutthof because they're pursuing a case. After all these years, what was that like?
So he wants to know, what was it like when the two German investigators came to your apartment last summer to interview you?
Since this happened, had been a very difficult time for me because I can't sleep at night. I keep thinking what happened and so forth. And to me, they were incredible. For four and a half hours, they were interviewing me. And now, Mr. Nestler, it is so wonderful you're here. And this to me is such a wonderful thing that I never thought I would survive. And this would happen. Strangers. But this happened that are interested what did to me when I was a child. And 147 members of my family were killed. I can't even begin to think in the millions. But my one family. And this is the kind of thing that I cannot let go. I have to, before I go down below, to see that young people, old people, we should all take for each other and care for one another.
So, you want me to? Okay. So, a couple of things. First of all, correction on the film. Obviously, my mother doesn't live in Santa Barbara anymore, as much as she would love to still live there, and wonders why we didn't move from Minnesota to Santa Barbara. But she's lived here for now 4 years. But this German proceeding is really a new chapter in her life. And it started last summer when I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., and at the end of the conference, I'm listening to my voicemail, and there's a voicemail from Betty from Knollwood Place Apartments where my mother lives. Well, I always like when you get a voicemail like that. First, Betty says, "Everything's okay. Don't worry, your mother's just fine." But then the next thing was, there was an FBI agent here, and he's looking for you, okay? And here's his number. So I like to hear from Jeff Van Nestler how this process works, but that's how it all started. I called the FBI agent, and he gave me the reason that he called was this German proceeding investigation is underway, and they have identified my mother as one of the few survivors of Stutthof, and they wanted to know if she'd be willing to participate in an interview. So I said, yeah, well, I'll check with her, but I was pretty certain that she would when I got back to Minneapolis. But he said, oh, by the way, I should also tell you that I was trying to find you, and I put my card in your mail slot at home. Well, I called my wife right away, and I said, just curious, did you see? Yeah, she said, why is there an FBI agent card here? There's something that I don't know about. And I said, no, I'll explain it all when I get back to Minneapolis. Well, sure enough, my mother agreed to participate in the interview. And it was 4 hours. When they walked in, my mother wanted to make sure they had something to eat. And after she knew that they were well fed, proceeded for the next 4 hours to ask her very detailed questions. What did the camp look like? Can you draw us a map? What were the conditions? How, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock, what did you do? And then after 3 hours, they held up a photograph and they said, do you recognize this man?
Yeah.
And she said, that's Meidele. That is what my mother used to call him because...
Think of yourself here tonight. This was about 74,000 years ago. Do you recognize somebody? We called him the Shane Meidel in Yiddish, in Jewish. And why? Because he was very, very, very an angry young man. And he would hit you. There were many people who were really beaten up by him and so forth. And I took at his, like this, on his, and I said, oh, that's Judy Meisel.
So,
And I think I stunned him.
yeah.
Are
Nope.
you sure? I said, yes, it's in my heart. My heart tells me this is it. There was someone else, but that one I didn't know.
So at that
This is something, yeah.
time, when it was a visceral.
My mother, I lost my mother in the gas chamber in Stutthof. You know what it is.
So right after she identified him, everybody in the room, the 2 German police officers, the 2 FBI staff that were there, one who was translating, the other who was holding the microphone, we were all shocked. We thought she was just going to be talking about the conditions, but that she really did identify the individual. And she took a break and came back. And I remember my mother asking the German, so tell me something, what would you do if you were me? I mean, look at him, how old? He was probably 17 years old when he was there. Tell me, if you were me, what would you do? And the German's response to my mother was, it's not for me to say, all we're here to do is to find the truth, and that's what this is all about. And I know the panel's going to be talking, and I'm very interested to hear from Professor Nestler, because that's what this is really all about, is finding the truth. I mean, I know my mother's story. I don't know the story of Johann and the other guard. I would really like to hear what they were doing there and let the judicial system, take its course. That's really what, this is all about, for us.
This is a perfect prelude to our next speaker, but yet again, let's have applause for Judith, please. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to ask Adam Hansen, one of our partners for tonight with the Federal Bar Association, who has worked so hard to put this program together, to come up to the, almost said the bema, that's the Hebrew word, to the stage. Okay. Thank you, Adam.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'm Adam Hansen with the Minnesota chapter of the Federal Bar Association, and I've promised to save the thank yous for the end of the program, but I'm going to have to break that rule. I just have to say thank you on my behalf and behalf of the Federal Bar Association to you, Judy, and to you, Michael, for participating and helping us put on this wonderful program. So thank you so much. I want to invite our 3 panelists to the stage, and it's an esteemed group, so you guys can go ahead and come up and take a seat at the table. Professor Cornelius Nestler, who Michael was referring to, is a German attorney and professor of law at the University of Cologne in Germany. I believe he has traveled the furthest of anyone on the panel, so we're very lucky to have him here in Bloomington tonight. Professor Nestler has represented victims of Nazi war crimes in the German legal system, and he'll explain a little bit more tonight about how that works. He's also representing Judith Meisel in the proceeding that began late in 2016. To his left is Jeff Van Nest, or to his right is Jeff Van Nest. Jeff Van Nest is the Chief Division Counsel of the FBI in Minnesota. Jeff's office has been instrumental in coordinating with the German authorities in investigating and ultimately prosecuting Nazi war crimes. And the far left is Dr. Ellen Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is the Executive Director of World Without Genocide, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing past and present genocides, problems of child soldiers, human trafficking, gender-based violence, weapons trafficking, and resource scarcity, and other causes of conflict. So please join me in welcoming our panel. Professor Nestler, let me begin with you. as I said, you're representing Judith as a co-plaintiff in a criminal action that was filed late in 2016 in Germany against 2 surviving guards at the Stutthof concentration camp. Who are these guards, and how did we find ourselves here in the year of 2018?
First of all, I want to say that it is an honor for me to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be able to join this evening together with especially Judith Meisel and her son. And I will try, professors like to talk too long. And the answer to your question, Adam, is actually a very long answer, and I will try to make it as short as possible. But it will take, I would say, some 10 to 15 minutes at least to give you some understanding how it could happen that 70 years after the Shoah, the mass murder of the Jews happened, and basically 50 years after the prosecution of SS perpetrators stopped in Germany, we are all of a sudden having new cases, and as a result of that, Judith can't sleep anymore, and I'm sitting here. So how did that come across? And there is another question that comes along with your question, Adam, that is, what is a co-plaintiff? I will try to explain that at the end. That is a concept that is obviously not, that you're obviously not familiar with. I will start with a very short overview of trials that have happened since 1946 against SS personnel in Stutthof. And I will try to explain why things changed in 2008, why the prosecutions started in 2008 in Germany. And at the end, I will say something about the role of a co-plaintiff and what it could mean for this case. So to understand why it is that the first trials between 46 and 48, 1946, 1948 happened in Poland has to do with the role of Stutthof as a camp. Because Stutthof as a camp between 39 and 42 was not under the regime of the concentration camps. It was more like a prisoner camp for Polish citizens who were sent into the camp as workforce. And therefore, very soon after the end of the war, Stutthof is close to Danzig, and Danzig was a part of Poland. After the war, the Polish authorities started to go after all the SS personnel that had been in Stutthof. And most of the SS personnel in Stutthof had come from the area of Danzig. So there were Polish people, and so they went after these, or Polish citizens, you have to say. So they went after these Polish citizens, and in these trials convicted not only for murder, they convicted for being part of a murder organization, the SS, and there were a high number of death convictions, and most of these death convictions were executed. After 49, when the new Germany was built, the responsibility for the prosecution of SS personnel would be an obligation of the German criminal justice system. But after 49, two things happened. One is the new Germany was interested in being built up, in doing all kinds of things, but not in looking back to the past. And the German population was not interested in anything that had to do with what I would call the Shoah rather than the Holocaust. And the Allies also weren't interested. Meaning we're in the times of Cold War, and there is a general understanding not look into the past, rather be anti-communist And it took in Germany until 1958, until the criminal justice system started a systematic approach of investigating and prosecuting the Shoah. And what happened then in the early years of the 60s was an approach to the extermination camps. And extermination camps, as you all know, but I still repeat it, are Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek was a kind of a mixed camp, Chelmno or Kulmhof was a pure extermination camp, Belzec. And the approach of the criminal justice system was that these very small numbers of SS personnel in these camps, Sobibor 15 to 20 German SS, 120 so-called helpers, Ukrainians who had been captured as soldiers from the Red Army and then were integrated into the SS system. So you have 15 to 20 German SS who were responsible for killing 250 Jewish people in about 15 months. That's Sobibor. So the legal understanding at that time was, and we're only discussing participation in murder, we're not discussing crimes against humanity, because this German understanding would be retroactive law, so it's only participation in murder. The understanding at that time was everybody who was part of the SS personnel in a place like Sobibor, Treblinka, etc., because of his function being part of the SS there, and what was the function of the SS there was just to kill people. These were death factories. So they were all responsible for accessory to murder. Then comes, and that is a very important step, comes the in Germany, a very famous so-called Auschwitz trial. That's 1963 until 1965. This was the trial that showed to the German public at the time what had happened in the Shoah and Auschwitz, and what happened in Auschwitz was used as an example. It was publicized, it was all over the country. It was, you could say it in a good way, a so-called show trial. And now the problem with Auschwitz was, and this problem was created by the judges at the time, was that Auschwitz was a camp that had two aspects. At least they thought it had two aspects. One aspect was a concentration camp, meaning people are incarcerated and are used as slave laborers as a workforce. And on the other side, Auschwitz became, after 1942, also one of the extermination camps. So Auschwitz, in the end, was the biggest extermination camps, aside to Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and so on. And what happened in the Auschwitz trial now was that they did not say every SS personnel in Auschwitz participated in murder. No, they said we have to look what the individual did, whether he was involved in a certain crime. So a certain crime could be the doctor, SS officer, standing on the ramp and making decisions, death, work, death, work. The function of a doctor doing that in itself was not enough, so there had to be evidence that he actually did this on the ramp. So you needed a witness saying, I saw him doing it. And so a doctor whose function could have been for 2 years making selections on the ramp, in the end could maybe only be convicted for this one time when somebody saw him standing on the ramp. So the conviction in the end would be participation in murder of an estimated number of people that were selected for death on that day. So again, I repeat that, after the Auschwitz trial, it was not every SS member in one of those camps would have been responsible for participating in the murder of all the people that were murdered in that camp. No. After the Auschwitz trial, you could only convict somebody where it could be proven that there was a certain activity in a certain murder of some people. And then something else happened. For reasons that I don't want to go into, the level of punishment for all those SS officers who just followed orders and not committed individual atrocities, all these people were only convicted for accessory to murder. So the idea was Hitler, Himmler, and some others were responsible for the Shoah, and all the other Germans only were helpers, only accessory to murder. So if an atrocity, Judith was talking about the baby that was smashed on the ground. If a witness came forward and said a baby was smashed on the ground, then this person would be committed for murder because, which is very ironic, this is not part of what the system wanted the SS to do. The system, Himmler, wanted to kill the Jews in an organized way and not smash babies on the ground. So if you did it in an organized way, it was only accessory to murder. If you did an atrocity which was not really asked for, although it happened constantly, then you could be convicted to a lifelong sentence. There is no death penalties in Germany. So the SS officer who might have selected thousands of people on the ramp to go into the gas chamber in the end would be convicted only to accessory to murder, and the punishment would be something between 5 or 7 years, not more. As a result of that, the organization in the criminal justice system that was responsible for investigating all these crimes, these prosecutors decided that all the SS personnel who were on a low level should not be prosecuted anymore. The argument was minor guilt. So if the SS officer on the ramp who had decided over the death of thousands of people was only convicted to 5 years, what do you give to a person who is just a guard? And the answer of the prosecutors in the 60s and 70s was dismissal of the cases. We don't want to try hundreds of thousands of people, actually hundreds or even thousands of people, and what should the punishment be in the end? This was the answer of the 60s and the 70s. And 60s and 70s in Germany means that still this is the generation of the war, maybe the first generation after the war. Still the understanding of the people was most of the Germans were actually victims of Hitler's politics and not, as Judy said it, who is responsible for the crimes. My answer would be maybe not the world, but I would say SS personnel in Auschwitz were responsible and not only Hitler. 60s, 70s, no prosecutions anymore. The 80s come, the 90s come, 2000 comes, 2008 comes, and now something happens which is actually it's an unbelievable story. My colleague and friend, Thomas Walter. So you should Google his name. Thomas is like Thomas, and Walter is like Walter, W-A-L-T-H-E-R. He's close to retirement, a judge in Bavaria, left-oriented guy. You'd say he decided at the end of his career he wants to go to the place called Ludwigsburg, and Ludwigsburg is the organization to investigate and prosecute Nazi crimes. But nothing was happening anymore in Ludwigsburg. So Thomas comes to Ludwigsburg, and basically the first thing he is told is, if you want to have an indictment, you have to prove that an SS person in one of these camps actually committed a crime. Like you have to prove he hit somebody and he died or something like that. So Thomas starts to investigate a case in the concentration camp of Ravensbrück. It's an SS guard, a woman who had a dog and was responsible for making sure that the women could not escape the camp. So she was would call it dog leader, maybe as a guard. Of course, he cannot find that single crime that she committed. And in the course of this work, he establishes a contact to Eli Rosenbaum. And you might say something about Eli Rosenbaum. Eli Rosenbaum was the chief or the head of the Office of Special Investigations at the Justice Department. I have talked to him a number of times. Like, if you want to talk to a Harvard-educated lawyer who has a strong opinion, that's Eli Rosenbaum. I know we're on video, so I did not use another word I could use for him. And he says, that's impossible. Like, a guard in a place like Treblinka, Sobibor, that should not be accessory to murder. And Thomas answers, yeah, but this is like German legal doctrine. And Eli says, I cannot believe that. And Thomas actually thinks this is also not right. And he starts to go on the website of the Justice Department. And what comes up? He is Googling. This is the change of the prosecution of Nazi crimes in Germany. Thomas Walter using Google. And he finds the court decision which again took away the citizenship from John Demjanjuk. And this court decision is very long. It's about 80 to 100 pages, and it's a summary of all the investigations of the OSI over the last 10, 15 years before 2001, I think, about John Demjanjuk. And it describes Sobibor as a death factory. And Thomas thinks like, a guard in a death factory, that has to be accessory to murder. And he goes to the chief officer in Ludwigsburg and asks them, I think we should do that. We should try to put together an investigation and in the end give it to the prosecutor so that John Demjanjuk will be prosecuted. So not only is it weird that the whole thing starts with Thomas Googling, it's also weird that it all starts with John Demjanjuk. So I hope I can do it in 2 or 3 minutes. So John Demjanjuk is one of these Ukrainians who were prisoners of war and in a place called Travniki was trained to be a helper to the SS. In the 70s, 2 things happen. A registration card of a Ukrainian soldier being an SS personnel with the name John Demjanjuk, or Ivan Demjanjuk, and his photo comes up. So you have the John Demjanjuk on the document. And the document shows that he was in the extermination camp of Sobibor. And there are transfer records showing him in Sobibor. At the same time, in another case, eyewitnesses in another case look at a sheet of photos, and one of the photos is the photo of Ivan Demjanjuk, and one of these eyewitnesses says, this is Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka. Now you have a problem with the evidence. You have eyewitnesses, and there were more and more eyewitnesses who said, Ivan Demjanjuk, this guy is Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka, and you have the documents that put Ivan Demjanjuk to Sobibor. The Justice Department and especially the Israeli prosecutors decided to prosecute John Demjanjuk as Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka. And this was the second largest Nazi trial that happened in Israel. Eichmann, 62 first, and then John Demjanjuk in the 80s. He was convicted to death. He was in the death cell. And 3-4 years later, now we're in 91, the Iron Curtain falls down. The investigators have access to the archives much better than before in the East, and they find out the wrong man. John Demjanjuk is not Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka. The Israeli Supreme Court turns over the verdict. John Demjanjuk comes back to the US. Justice Department has a major problem because they, in the 70s, already had evidence that could have shown that John Demjanjuk was not Ivan the Terrible, but they had withheld that evidence. There are court decisions against the Justice Department. John Demjanjuk gets his citizenship back, and OSI is taking the case on again, but now the guard in Sobibor. And they strip him of his citizenship. They want to deport him. No country in the world wants to have John Demjanjuk. And this is the situation when Thomas Walter uses Google and finds the case of John Demjanjuk. Investigation starts, and actually John Demjanjuk is put on trial in Munich in 2009, from 2009 to 2011. Now, legally, this is a very, very new case, because all one knew and all one knows until today is that for 3.5 months, John Demjanjuk was a SS guard in an extermination camp in Sobibor. There's no witness to whatever John Demjanjuk did on a certain day. But there is lots of evidence what the purpose of being a guard in Sobibor was. And the purpose of being a guard in Sobibor was, when the trains arrived and the people were all pushed into the gas chambers, was to make sure that the process could happen. And for being a guard, John Demjanjuk gets convicted 5 years. He was, I think, 89 years old at the time. So he was convicted to 5 years because of accessory to murder. So now, John Demjanjuk, prisoner of war. The SS forced him, kind of, maybe he participated, nobody really knows, to help. But a prisoner of war in 1942, in one of these camps, had to fear for his life. So the exit for John Demjanjuk not to die in one of those camps was to cooperate with the Germans. He gets convicted. What is with all the German SS guards from Auschwitz, from Stutthof, from all these places? And now a new wave of investigations start. I have, together with Thomas, participated, or we were involved in, I think, 15 of those investigations. 3 of them actually made it to trial. The first one is the case of John Demjanjuk, and 2 other ones are Auschwitz trials. One is about this guy who called this the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, Oskar Gröning. He died 2 days ago. I think he was convicted for a function on the ramp in Auschwitz and making sure that the process on the ramp could go faster. Only 3 cases. And there is a development in these cases. The first case against Oskar Gröning was still the part of Auschwitz which is extermination camp. So as I just said, he was convicted for a certain function that he had working on the ramp. His function was to make sure that all these mountains of luggage on the ramp would be brought away fast enough so that when the people came with the next train, they were not available and not aware of the situation, so just speed up the process. That was actually the job of Oskar Gröning. Then comes the next indictment, which led to a trial in 2016. And the next indictment goes a step further and says, Auschwitz was an extermination camp not only because of the extermination of the people who were sent from the ramp to the gas chambers. It was an extermination camp in itself. So why? Because, and Judith has said that before, no Jewish person who came to Auschwitz should ever survive. This was the concept. It was only a matter of time. Either the people were exterminated right away, or they were used for forced labor, under conditions where people could actually not survive. Not enough food, non-existence of any kind of hygienic situation. They were just dying from not being taken care of and not being able to take care of themselves. This is the definition of Auschwitz. And all these, we have seen some of these pictures of people who were called, I don't know what the English term is, Muselmänner, like these walking skeletons. Yeah. So in the indictment, in the Stutthof indictment, it says people were fed with 1,100 calories. I think this is the official figure. People were fed with 400 to 600 calories. If you do hard work, 11 hours a day, and you get 400 to 600 calories, the time span to survive for a normal person is somewhere around 3 months. And then some sickness could come, some epidemic, then it's all. So this is Auschwitz also. So Auschwitz is an extermination camp in many ways. And this indictment from 2015, which led to a trial against a guy called Hansen in 2016 in front of the district court in Detmold, describes Auschwitz as a extermination camp for all the Jews who ever came to Auschwitz. With that description, it's a logic step to go to any concentration camp at the end of October 44 to the end of the war. If you look at Stutthof, in the summer, late summer, tens of thousands of Jewish people like Judith were brought to Stutthof. There was not enough food, there was no shelter, there was no clothes, there were diseases all over, there was systematic killing. So Stutthof, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, Flossenbürg, wherever you go, beginning in September, October 44, they were extermination camps. They were planned to be concentration camps, and they turned to be into extermination camps. So if the new legal argument is, and it's not new, it was already the legal argument in the 60s in extermination camps. If the argument is everybody who helps that these crimes of letting the people die or just killing the people inside the camp, everybody who helps commits accessory to murder, then everybody who is just a guard in a camp like this commits accessory to murder. And
Professor,
this is...
Let me ask you about that exact point, because you were kind enough to provide us a copy of the indictment in English, and it's a very sobering document. It's 65 pages, single-spaced, and very detailed about the horrors at the Stutthof concentration camp. But then you get to the portion about Johann's participation, and it's almost, I don't want to use the word mundane, but he was a guard, he was conscripted, he stood on this tower for this shift in the morning, and then he moved and he stood at this guard, at this gate, and so forth. So is that the legal theory, that anyone who essentially participated is in fact an accessory to these thousands of murders?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Let me ask you one follow-up question. I know we discussed this over the phone, and then I do want to hear from the other panelists, but I have more questions for you as well. Is there a concern, both of these defendants are in their 90s, is there a concern about the trial being able to proceed against defendants of such an advanced age in terms of their fitness to stand trial?
Yes. I'll do something one should not do, but I still do it. I use your question to come to my last point, talking about the co-plaintiffs. And then I come back to the question of how can you have a trial against defendants who are 94, 95 years old. Back to 2008. Somehow I get into contact with Thomas Walter, and we're talking about how could a trial against John Demjanjuk, an old man, who had been convicted falsely in Israel already. What could that trial look like? And we're thinking about it, and we came up with this idea. You have to give the victims a face. If you have a trial where you just have an old defendant who looks really sick, Demjanjuk played his sick role, he wasn't as sick as the media pictures were, but anyways, you have an old defendant, everybody will ask, why put these old people on trial? And the only answer, especially with the media and the public, would be because there are victims from the same age group, survivors. And the survivors can give a face to the victims that Demjanjuk and other guys will be convicted for, which is their family members. So the reason why a person like Judith would be a co-plaintiff in a trial like this is because she could give evidence about her mother. She could give a face to her mother and tell the story of her mother. She could make the court and the public understand why a trial against a person as old as he is, 95 years old, should happen. And so one last remark about this concept of a co-plaintiff. American system is adversarial. Two parties, and so you can't add on a third party. How can you have another prosecutor? German system is inquisitorial, which means the court takes the evidence, and at the end, the court decides what is the truth. So if you have a state prosecutor plus a private prosecutor, and a co-plaintiff has the rights of a prosecutor, so she is just an additional private prosecutor with the help of her lawyer, it is not a problem so much for the German system, because at the end, the courts just pick what they think is important. So if I represent Judith in the trial in Germany and I disagree with what the state prosecutor does, it's not a problem. We can argue with each other. The court will decide in the end. But again, why is it important to have these co-plaintiffs? And I will give you, and then I really stop. I want to give you a citation of what one of my clients in the Auschwitz trial said. If this thing opens, open. So this woman, who was my client, when she came to Auschwitz and the selection happened, her mother had told her, put on a thick coat. And there's this like tiny, she's a very tiny person. I know her, I'm friends with her now, I met with her a couple of weeks ago. At the time, she's 13 years old, a tiny girl, but she has on a major coat. And at the selection, the selecting officer decides, goes like this, and decides, okay, workforce. 13-year-old girls, when they were tiny, would not survive the ramp in Auschwitz, never. They were not useful as workforce. And she was not very useful. With her older sister and her older cousin, the rest of the family was gassed on the same day. She ended up in this part of Auschwitz, which is called Canada, where they had to sort the clothes. And so she worked as a sort clothing person, and then it was Death March and 2 other camps, and she survived. And she gave a final statement in the trial against Oskar Gröning. And so I'll have it here. And I think this describes the importance of the participation of survivors in these kind of trials. So she said, in closing of her final statement in the trial, I would like to address some comments the defendant has made regarding his role at Auschwitz. He has said that he does not consider himself a perpetrator, but merely a small cog in the machine. But if he were sitting, the defendant, were sitting here today wearing his SS uniform, actually, the person who sat there was 94 years old, an old, weak man. But if he were sitting here today wearing his SS uniform, I would tremble. and all the horror that I experienced as a 13-year-old would return to me. To that 13-year-old, any person who wore that uniform in that place, Auschwitz, represented terror and the depths to which humanity can sink, regardless of what function they performed. And today, at the age of 84, I still feel the same way. The purpose of co-plaintiffs in these cases is to give statements like this. Thank you.
Dr. Kennedy, to Professor Nestler's point, we tend to think of criminal law oftentimes in terms of adjudicating guilt or revealing innocence. What is the broader purpose of these sorts of proceedings in terms of victims telling their stories?
I think it's terribly important for us to step back and think about that big picture. Thank you for that great question. These trials are part of what we call transitional justice. How do we move from the heinous crimes that occurred back to the just rule of law and to some form of social stability? And in the West, we tend to think of a trial as being only about retribution, about punishing the offenders, punishing the guards, punishing the people who ran the gas chambers, and so on. Criminal justice is indeed retributive, but the trial itself is more than that. First, it provides historical documentation. So the 65-page testimony that you referred to, the statements that you looked at, it's really the finding the truth about what happened. And then second, for the trial that Ms. Meisel will participate in, it validates the stories of the witnesses, of the victims, and of the survivors. Because as Steve Honix mentioned, many people today discredit those stories. They deny that the Shoah, that the Holocaust occurred. So part of the function of that trial is to say there was that reality, that victims or survivors' statement really is true. And then third, and I think very, very critically, it validates the victim's experience. It honors the memories, and it says to the family and to that community, you don't have to bear this in private. We are all here tonight feeling great compassion for the story, for the family. It doesn't have to be a private burden. It can be shared in some way through our feelings and through the inspiration that these stories give us to create a better world. All of these are part of what that trial will do.
Dr. Kennedy, in your experience, is there a particular value to having trials like this in the home country, so to speak?
Absolutely. You mentioned, Professor, the effort to try to get countries to take back, to try to get Germany, for example, to take back some of the people who were denaturalized, trials that occurred here. And I actually was in a meeting with Eli Rosenbaum just a few days ago, and he said that of the 132 cases that they prosecuted so far, they've won 108, but one of the biggest problems is trying to get a country somewhere in the world to take those aging people who perpetrated these crimes back. If those trials had occurred in the places where the crimes had occurred, there would be yet another measure towards justice, towards social acknowledgement. Professor, you mentioned that often the culpability is blamed only on Hitler and on a few Nazis, when indeed the system was far broader. To have a trial in the place where that crime occurred begins to resonate more broadly throughout a community. So I think that's very important. And we see that with trials that are going on today for the genocide in Guatemala, trials in Guatemala City, trials that are being held in Argentina, and so on. So I think it's very important. But if trials cannot happen in those places where the crimes originated, certainly to do them anywhere is better than not to do them at all.
Jeff, question for you. Tell us about the FBI's involvement in this case and how it fits into the Bureau's prosecution and investigation of war crimes generally.
Yeah, so I'll start with the latter first to kind of frame the issue a little bit. So most of my work in this area was back at FBI headquarters as head of the Genocide War Crimes Unit. And so our unit back in 2010 sort of inherited the mantle from the old OSI. So OSI and the Domestic Security section of the Department of Justice were merged into what is now the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section. Eli Rosenbaum is there in that section today, a good friend of ours. And the FBI then, together with our counterparts in the Department of Homeland Security, have an interagency function to work these types of cases, but more globally, to work atrocities worldwide. And so, you know, the question, Judy's question of what is the cause of the Holocaust, I'd like to flip that on its head a little bit and ask the question, what does the accountability mechanism look like? Because as we're hearing from the professor, there are some big jurisdictional gaps here. We have all of this passage of time, and yet what does the law look like? What are countries able to do under their statutes? And so I just want to quickly talk about how the international community is working to fill those gaps and what it looks like today, and how we can deliver accountability today to the victims. And so following World War II, without German domestic prosecutions, we had Nazi war criminals fleeing worldwide and basically finding safe haven in a variety of countries, including the United States. And so what was our ability to deliver justice? We couldn't try them for the substantive offense that had been committed overseas. What United States statute had been violated by these atrocities in Germany? There weren't any. We could try them for an immigration violation because undoubtedly they lied on some paperwork as they entered the United States. That's an immigration fraud case. Statute of limitations is going to be somewhere between 5 and 7 years. Likely that was not going to be a viable alternative for us. And then there is civil denaturalization, and the case that the professor talked about was in the appellate courts for 10 years, going up to the Sixth Circuit. And so denaturalization became a very time-consuming and albeit impractical justice. And so there's this huge jurisdictional gap. What do we do time and time again when we have atrocities overseas and the perpetrators flee to find safe haven? And so following World War II, through a series of international treaties, the international community got together and said, for these atrocious crimes, torture, genocide, war crimes, use of child soldiers, we will enter into international treaties of which the United States is a party, and we will agree as treaty signatories to amend our criminal law, and on the federal level it's Title 18, to criminalize atrocities that are committed overseas, so that if the perpetrator makes the mistake of coming to the United States, we can now try them for the substantive offense that they committed overseas. And so that's very much what the architecture looks like today. And so we are, together with the interagency, looking for perpetrators worldwide, not only of the Nazi era, but you can go back to the dirty wars in Latin America. You could talk about the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda. These perpetrators are worldwide. And a good news story is that a lot of our allied countries have specialized war crimes units, as we do. And so we share information and we work closely with not only the Germans, but the Swedes, the Dutch, the French, the UK. There is a community of war crimes investigators out there who routinely share information. And so, you know, together, when we receive a lead from our German counterparts, we're going to take that on board and we are going to assist on their behalf. Just as if we found a Nazi perpetrator here in the United States, we would be reaching back to the Germans and we would be saying, we're going to need witnesses and evidence, let's have a conversation about it. And so the flow of information is very much two-way. I can get into a little more detail of what that looks like, but for the non-lawyers out there, I don't want to do a deep dive into what an MLAT is and a letter rogatory and stuff like that.
Thank you, Jeff. This is a question for anyone on the panel. In 2017, the Anti-Defamation League reported that incidents of anti-Semitic conduct in the United States were up 57% over 2016. Why is this happening, and what can we do about it? And Dr. Kennedy, why don't we start with you, and then we'll get Jeff's law enforcement perspective.
Yeah, not only anti-Semitic crimes, but also crimes against Muslims. And what we've seen is that enormous spike that you just referenced began in 2016, and it's manifest in physical assaults, it's school-based bullying, it's verbal harassment, virtually every kind of acting out in prejudicial ways, like what is described in the film in the beginning of the scenes in Philadelphia. I think the why is pretty clear in our country. There has been a real effort, I think, to demonize people from certain racial, ethnic, national, and religious groups. And to the question that was asked earlier about what should be done, what can people do, who is responsible, every one of us is responsible. Every one of us has to stand up when we see something, the sign on the way to the airport, if you see something, say something. If you hear something that's inappropriate, it's up to each and every one of us to stand up for our neighbor, to stand up for that person in our midst who is being harassed, who is being made uncomfortable simply based on his or her identity. It's our obligation. Otherwise, we're on a slippery slope where that dehumanization of people based on those characteristics I mentioned can lead us to treat them in ways that are truly abhorrent. Just today, or maybe it was yesterday, the FBI announced that they have found the 3 people responsible for the bombing of the mosque here in the Twin Cities. That was a heinous crime. And those people are saying that they wanted to let Muslims know that they don't belong in this country and to go home and that they hate them. Well, how are we allowing this to happen? We all have to stand up and say, this is not all right. My family originally came from Lithuania. I'm Jewish. And I went back to Lithuania, and I was in Kovno, and I was in Vilna, the city that my extended family came from, and where they perished. And the fear that Jews are feeling because of the spike in anti-Semitism, and that Muslims are feeling, and that immigrants and refugees are feeling, and that our LGBTQ community is feeling, it's our responsibility. So I applaud all of you, all of us, for being here tonight, because it shows me that we all care, and it's up to all of us to take these messages back and then to act on them, to stand up when someone says something in a restaurant or on a bus or in a workplace, to really do the thing that is right. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Jeff, I was going to ambush you with my next question and see if I could squeeze some information out of the FBI about its active investigation of the bombing of the Dar Farouk Mosque and the arrests that happened or that were announced yesterday. But rather than talk about the specifics of that case, what lessons is the FBI drawing from the work that you described earlier to investigate and prosecute these domestic acts?
It's a wonderful question. And I think a lot of what we are trying to do is community engagement and outreach, because I would wager that as we get in to talk to various diaspora communities from Central Africa, West Africa, They have no idea that the FBI even cares about atrocities that were committed in Liberia during the Civil War. We care very much, and we want that information. And so a lot of times it's just getting into communities and explaining what our role is and that we're looking for information. Because for us, it doesn't matter if it's a witness, a perpetrator, or someone has information that could be an active lead for us. We want that information. And in a way, I think of it in the hate crime context as well. We want to know, and law enforcement wants to know at all levels, when rhetoric switches over to threats of violence and violence. And we want that information, so if someone feels victimized, you don't have to be in the business of being a constitutional scholar and figuring out, was this protected speech, was this not protected speech? If you feel threatened, we want to know about it.
I want to mention an upcoming event because Fred Amram is here. Fred, raise your hand. Fred Amram is also a Holocaust survivor and a board member of World Without Genocide. And next month, Fred and I are giving a talk about Nazi laws and about the impact on those laws on his family, almost all of whom did not survive the Holocaust. And we're giving that talk at Park Square Theater. WorldWithoutGenocide.org, you can find the information there. But the important point that I want to mention is that the managing director of Park Square called me and he said, I'd like to do something important that night. He said, I would like to declare the theater, Park Square Theater in downtown St. Paul, to be a safe space for Muslims and Jews. And you know, it brings me to tears even to say that we are at a point in our community when we need to do something like that. But I applaud him for that. And I'm hoping that the city of St. Paul and St. Paul's mayor will designate that day and that space to be something very special. But it's up to all of us to make sure that we don't have to think about that, about having safe spaces for Muslims and Jews.
Professor.
Thank you.
Professor Nestler, a very practical question as we near the end of our program. If and when this case proceeds to trial, what we think of cross-examination in our American system, will Judy be afforded an opportunity to confront the defendant in court, to ask questions, to give testimony at a very practical level? I mean, can she do it from here via video? Does she have to fly to Germany? How is that going to work?
One of the problems with these trials is that defendants, if they are capable of standing a trial, will not be able to spend more than, let's say, 3 hours per day in the trial. And that has a high number of practical consequences. The court will make a decision that will very likely be that survivors who are present in court will have the opportunity to give a statement. The court will very likely decide not to give the possibility to co-plaintiffs or witnesses who are not in court to give a statement. So the only possibility for Judith, if she does not want to come to Germany, to be somehow present is by representation through her lawyer and statements the lawyer can make in her behalf. We have other lawyers who had clients who lived in the area of Atlanta, and one of these other cases tried to bring forward legal arguments that their clients should have the possibility via video link or whatever to be present in the trial. They were not successful, and I think in the end the court could not only deny these motions on a legal base, and I think in the end it was also a wise decision not to widen the case in a way that a case like this could not care, really. So this is a very practical answer to your question. If Judith or other survivors are present, we as her lawyers would try to guide her in a way that she can make a relatively concise statement. And to your question whether she could ask the defendant some questions, of course she can ask the defendants questions. I would say if the defendant's counsel is not totally crazy, then he will advise the defendant not to answer the questions. And would it be important to give a testimony? This is the question that arises in all these cases. Why is it necessary? I mean, there's no camp where everything is as present and discovered and worked on as Auschwitz. I mean, if you just have to go on the internet and you know what happened on the ramp in Auschwitz, so why do we need survivors as witnesses? Yes, we need them, because they can describe what is not only a historical fact, they can describe what they felt when they came there, what it meant to them, and they can also describe what the behavior of the SS guards meant for them when they arrived. So all of a sudden, under normal rules, there are valid witnesses. And one more sentence, then I stop, Adam, is I always thought that the defendants in these cases will actually be just the cogs in the machine, so the lowest rank SS people. The two defendants in Stuttgart are very low rank, that is for sure. So in this last trial against this guy called Hanning, the Auschwitz trial, I went into the case and I thought, okay, this is one of those SS guards. And then there comes a historian, and all these historians, they learned over the last 10, 15 years from all these trials, and in the trials we learned from the historians. So the whole science of Nazi history really came a push. This historian comes and he gives us a lecture and explains to us that on the level of the 4,500 guards in Auschwitz, this guy was on the second level. So the guy where we all thought he's just a cog, he was responsible for commanding 60 people. So if a train with up to 5,000 people arrives on the old ramp, and there are 5,000 people coming out of that train, and you have to make sure that everything, from the perspective of the SS, that everything goes perfect. Then you have around 120 people, guards, standing around, making sure that everything functions. And this guy, Hanning, was one of the 3 officers at the place commanding these 120. So this is not a low cog. This is on a very high level. One of the SS officers who made possible that these 5,000 people could be killed in that night. And without that trial, we would have never known that, never heard of that. And so actually, in the beginning, when I got involved in these cases, I thought, what is it that I can really learn? I thought not so much, but I can do a good job representing my clients. And from trial to trial, I learn more and more and more. And I think you can never stop learning about how the Shoah was organized and what happened. Yes, point.
Thank you. Let me direct my final question to Judy and Michael, if you're up for it. I know you've been listening intently to this presentation, but given what Professor Nestler has said, Judy, if you're able to participate in this trial and ask the defendant, Johann Rehbogen, a question or make a statement, what would you say to him?
If you were able to meet Johann, the Nazi guard, what is it that you would ask him or tell him?
Well, I would ask him one of the things, that you were in such good looking as far as everything as a human being. Did you realize what you were getting into? what you were getting in to destroy so many people. And for me to say what they should do now with him, I can't. But I have to tell you, I wanted to remember that he should remember what he did and how many thousands of people were destroyed, and babies, little babies, destroyed them, not to just throw them on the asphalt wall and then they died with a scream. This is what I remember. So how can I tell them what I would want? I can't. I have to tell you, which I didn't, the most important thing. I owe my life. How many of you are Danish origin here? Raise your hand. I owe my life to the Danish people. I weighed 47 pounds. I was 15 years old when they found me, and they put me in a hospital. I didn't have insurance. Nobody has their insurance. And I have to tell you something. They gave me the most important thing, is to be, again, a human being. And that I want to thank you. And I want to thank you more than anything else, that when I look out at this, and I can't believe I'm sitting here, and what I have remembered about everything, how wonderful we are as human beings. Why can't we keep doing it and invite each other, different religions, so you can remember each other and not separate from each other? Togetherness is the most important thing. And if you smile and laugh, think about, we are a much older group of people. And what I say to the young people is, I am going to be 90 next year, if I should live that long. But it's not my life, but it's their life, and they should work as hard as they can to make this world a better world. Thank you. And good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. Thank you for joining us tonight.